the Gribshunden, what Gribshunden means is griffon hound or griffon dog, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. It's a shipwreck that sunk in 1495, so it's over 500 years old. You can see from the picture on the left there that there is quite a significant amount of very well preserved remains of the hull and the ship itself. The main reason for this being that it is completely buried. So it's buried, much like Gary's talk yesterday evening, in an anoxic environment, which protects it. In addition, it's very low saline water and very cold water for most of the year. The location is in the Baltic, off the southern coast of Sweden, behind a small island called Stora Ekon in the Blekinge archipelago near Ronneby. And this is a known anchorage right back through history, because behind the island is extremely well protected from the predominant winds. It's very rare you get a wind that affects behind the island. And the Gribshunden was at anchor here, along with the rest of the fleet. This was actually the King of Denmark at the time's flagship, because this region at that time in 1495 was part of Denmark, is now part of Sweden. And the records show that there was a ship fire, the ship burnt and sunk. So our base was at a beautiful place that's part of the local museum, where they uphold the abilities and skills of traditional boat building. The curator of the boatyard that's aligned to the museum builds these beautiful boats on the right there from scratch. So cutting the planks, steaming the wood, bending it to shape, to effectively use traditional shipmaking techniques on a smaller scale. And our base was here. So in the background of that photo, you can see an open shed. This was our compressor room, booster, oxygen, softener line, and all the necessary logistics to keep our equipment up and running. The bigger building just on the edge of the picture to the right was our conservation lab. So we had the museum's conservation team actually take part in the project. They were on site live with us. So as we recovered things from the wreck site during the dives, they were lifted onto the back of our vessel, the Swan, which you can see on the left there, a catamaran, very good working platform, put in conservation tanks on the boat, transferred in the evening directly into our onshore conservation room, and then at the end of the project, at the end of the month, taken straight back to the university. And part of the logic of this was the expedition, which took place in 2019 for ourselves, was funded in reverse. Firstly, the aim for a display area within the museum complex was dealt with. Secondly, the full funding for conservation of any artifacts lifted, which is an incredibly expensive part. And then finally, the diving. So it was effectively done in reverse to guarantee that anything lifted would be looked after appropriately and then displayed. So the Gribshunden was first dived in 1970 by the local dive club. They went out to dive a deeper wreck beyond the island. Conditions were too rough, so they dropped in behind the island in the sheltered waters just to do a dive, and found timbers sticking out of the water. Now the photo you see here is at the very end of our project in 2019. This is after approximately 3 weeks of work. The archaeological trench frame grid that you see almost above the diver there in the picture, when we started, that was basically at seabed level. So during 3 weeks, using water dredge, we excavated down from seabed level nearly 2 meters into our permitted trench, and eventually revealed these marvelous timbers of the side of the ship. And this is basically actually the starboard side of the ship, about midships, a little bit back from midships, because this style of ship would have a huge castle or fighting keep at the bow and the stern, and our trench was just in front of the stern castle. So this is basically roughly where we are on the ship. This basically hand-drawn survey done by one of our archaeologists back in the early times when it was found is really quite amazing. And having done my NAS training on land and in the water up at Stony Cove, this is basically what we're taught to do, but done on an incredibly gifted scale by one of the Swedish archaeologists. The arrow points to where we had chosen to put our trench. And the trench was originally permitted to be 6 meters by 2 meters. During the project, because of what we were finding, we were given a live extension to our permit while we're there to extend the length of the trench. But the red arrow shows you roughly where we were working. And importantly, if you look, the red arrow points directly onto a left-right large timber, at the end of which, each end, there are 2 timbers pointing like an arrow themselves, effectively making a letter A. Just remember that for a few slides' time, because it's what's incredible to me, having done some drawing of underwater wreckage by hand on my training up on the Gresham in Stony Cove, is the detail of this and the accuracy of it. A couple of points on it. To the far left, number 8 at the top. Just to the right of that, number 7, is the hawser eye that the anchor rope would have passed through on the bow. This is the port hawser. The starboard one is there buried as well. Right at the opposite end of the picture, you'll see a number 2 pointing at a piece of timber, and just above it a number 3 on what is the remains of the rudder. So just to give you an orientation, bow is to the left, rudder and starboard is, stern is to the right, and this is basically the area that we're working. Give you a general idea of size of the Gribshunden. It's approximately 30 meters long, and the site now lays at approximately 15 meters in width. So here we have John Adams from Southampton University. The 2019 project was jointly run by Lund University, who I work for as a diving safety officer for the Maritime Archaeological Department, Sotterton University and Southampton University. And I spent a lot of my free weeks being John Adams' buddy to basically do any heavy lifting and any rigging, and basically just be a general dog's body, which was an incredibly humbling experience, because to watch him work and to learn from him, because he was very agreeable in answering questions when we got out of the water, was absolutely fascinating. So here you can see those timbers. As we said, this is on the starboard side of the wreck, approximately midships within our trench. You can see there me holding a small plastic float that's been inflated. And basically what this is a buoy to make just about neutral the water dredge. Now the water dredge works a little bit differently to an airlift. I know a lot of you listening will know exactly what it is, but I'll explain it simply. We have a water pump on a pontoon above the wreck. The pontoon was on a 4-point mooring, so we could just drive out to site, tie up to the pontoon and work each day. The water pump is on the pontoon to decrease the noise for those on board the vessel all day. And basically, like a standard water pump for pumping out a ditch, it pumps water up from the sea down to the seabed. So the upper of those 2 pipes is water coming from the surface down, round that U-bend, and then back down the light grey pipe, creating suction through the angle point to give gentle suction, controllable suction for excavation. And the key there is gentle excavation, not digging. Now, back to that hand-drawn sketch. This is basically a photo map of the site. I do have a full playable 3D version of this from the photogrammetric model shot by Brett Seymour from the US National Park Service and created by Paula Dadaris from Lund University on their supercomputer. But I've taken it out of this talk today because we're doing it live over the internet and it uses up a lot of bandwidth. But I can share it with people later if anyone is interested. But the red arrow there is the same point where our trench was. And you can see that letter A of timbers. And really, when you look at this with the hawser eye to the left, the rudder remains to the right, the A of timbers in the middle, the accuracy of the hand-drawn sketch from a few slides back is really quite mind-blowing. So here's a colour shot of that main area. You can see these grid legs, the longitudinal sections running sort of down the picture were 6 meters long. The cross members were 2 meters long. This was built from scaffold supplies that were in the shipyard where we were based. And then we spray painted it grey to make it stand out better for our operations. And as I said, when we started, if you look at the top left of the picture where the yellow tape is on the piece of scaffold, that was pretty much touching the seabed when we started. Now, if you look at the leg, right in the middle under the UN of Gribshunden, the word at the top, these legs are extendable. And what we did, we placed them on timbers that we bought from shore. And also the timbers were on canvas bags. And the reason for that was we wanted to increase the footprint of the leg so that it wouldn't sink down into the sediment, landing on, pushing on and damaging some delicate artifact that was beneath. Obviously, we didn't know what was beneath at this time, but when we started to recover artifacts from within this area, some of the objects that you'll see shortly, if they'd have been hit by that trench leg, it would have been disastrous. So these extended footprints stop that occurring, a bit like snowshoes when walking on snow, stopping your foot sinking through. And obviously, you can see how deep we got there. This is basically digging on the outside of the ship, so starboard outer on the seabed, effectively going down the side of the hull underneath to expose the timbers. We had a variety of people there whose specialty was ship timbers and ship construction and ship architecture, and this was the main push of the expedition, was to determine the nature of the build of the ship, to get some timbers to analyze the age and location this ship was built, and to learn as much as possible about its structure, because being 1495, it was basically a key period of ship architecture. You can see the archaeologists there working with the dredge. There's a flexible tube on the end of the pipe to give control and flexibility to the area wishing to be recovered or removed. And what we're generally doing is using that suction to clear away sediment to give visibility, as opposed, as we said, to digging. Now, this thing amazed me quite incredibly. This is a hand-drawn view of the timbers from the inside of the hull as we exposed it, drawn by John Adams. And I know for a fact, I've been teaching and working with divers for the last 30 years, and I carry a slate or a wet book with me and a pencil. And sometimes I have to write notes to my students or to my scientists or to divers I'm with, and very occasionally make some sketches to help with surveying or cave mapping or something along these lines. And it always looks like a spider has been dipped in ink and allowed to run across the page and is virtually illegible. Now, this is not a redrawn sketch that John redrew from memory and a rough sketch after the dive in the evening. This is what he drew on his A4 slate while hanging upside down in his dry suit on the wreck. And it's to me, it's absolutely mind-blowing that someone can sketch and draw to that degree of detail underwater. And John explained to me that the reason he does this is basically if he takes the time to draw what he sees, it's like the drawing is an act of programming his brain with what he's seen, and it stays with him for the rest of his career. So he can remember things he's seen from wrecks he's worked for the last several decades because he draws them on site, which is quite an interesting thing to hear. So one of the main purposes of the 2019 project that was under the permit is we were permitted to take a section of primary hull timber and therefore to be enabled to do dendrochronological analysis of the timber. And the idea was, of course, to confirm age. Now, we'll come later on and talk to why we already knew this was the Gribshunden. So the age was fairly well determined as to when she sunk from the records. But what they wanted was to know the age of the timbers and, most importantly, where they came from. And interestingly, we're in what was Denmark and is now southern Sweden, where the wreck sunk. And the timbers, once they were dendrochronologically analysed, were found to come from an area which is now Belgium, France, Germany. So if you imagine an area just in the sort of join point of that, forests there. And one of the hypotheses is, well, hang on, why would they buy timber or import timber from there when there was at that time plenty of good timber in Denmark and in what is now Sweden, the area where the ship was found and where the king was based? And one of the hypotheses that they actually had some of the components built there, so effectively were buying in technology that other people were using. Obviously, it's a hypothesis, an idea, but of great interest. I can say as a diver, not an archaeological scientist, one of the hardest jobs I had on this project was helping the scientists to basically saw this piece of timber off. Now the Guardian divers, which is my professional dive team, non-scientists, we basically dive one-to-one with all the archaeologists and effectively watch their back, do the heavy lifting and work, etc. But we dive on closed circuit rebreather to give duration, etc. And the Johan Ronby was the one who went down with the wood saw and hacked through and pulled this piece of timber off. So quite an incredible piece of work. A lot of sawing. If anyone's ever tried to use a saw while underwater, as you push, it pushes you back. So quite difficult to do. So this is John working on site. As you can see, we're not using the water dredge to dig. We're using it, you can see there, delicate amounts of sediment being lifted up and blown through the tube, and a paintbrush to just remove layer by layer the dust left behind. The Guardian diver providing huge amounts of light with orca lights, so lots of visibility, lots of ability to see what's going on, and gradually layer by layer exposing what's there, and most importantly documenting it to get context. One of the first things we found as we started to work down into the hull was barrels, and what we've been doing here this week, we've been out on the wreck through midweek this week while we're here, is recovering quite a lot of these barrel components, because what they want to do now is do dendrochronology on the barrel components to see where the barrels were, the timber that makes the barrels was sourced, and if there is a big age difference between the barrels and the ship. Now what you can see in the picture on the left is the barrel base with the measure on it, and barrel staves rising up. And for me, having done some sort of primitive people's bushcraft training over the years, one thing that fascinated me is modern barrels, or even not so modern barrels, are held together with metal hoops that are basically hammered down onto the staves to push the staves together to make the barrel watertight. Now these barrels were made so early that the metal hoops had not evolved as yet. So in the picture on the right there, you can see that the barrel staves were held together with withies. And these are basically plaited tree roots that are applied while still wet. And then when they dry out, they shrink, pulling the barrel staves together to also make the barrel waterproof. So really quite amazing to find these pieces of material intact below that anoxic level. And there's a close-up of that withy root system holding those staves together. And depending on the barrel, some of the staves would basically have plug holes with wooden plugs like a cork, square holes with plugs, so basically whatever was in the barrel could be sampled. And one of the things we wanted to do was to try and find evidence of what these barrels contained, because a bit like amphora on very ancient wrecks, they contained a wide variety of things, not just wine. Barrels the same could have contained a wide variety of things, and we wanted to see if we could find out what. The barrel lids were often marked as this one marked with a brand of a letter, often carved with a letter as well. These lids were brought up in 2019. We made stretchers for them, put them on the stretchers and strapped them on with bungee and lifted them to the surface. And most of these delicate items were lifted by diver, not by lift bag, to give good conservation and no damage during a lifting process. Before anything was removed from its sediment, before anything was lifted to surface, it was photographed in situ, drawn in situ. It was then photogrammetrically modeled by Brett Seymour from the US National Park Service in situ, and then lifted. So effectively creating a complete digital timeline of what was found and its context, where it was in the wreck and what it was in relation to. We were very lucky. Our project was August, water temperature varied. I think the lowest it got was 12 and the highest it got was 18. That was based on the currents. So I was able to wear just gardening gloves to protect the hands, and no need for dry gloves. Visibility was also very good. As you can see there, we had on average around 10 meters of green visibility. Lots and lots of jellyfish in the water, but not stingers. So quite a pretty green environment to work in. There's one of the barrels recovered from earlier, 2006 to 2016, when test projects went out. So this one has already been conserved, and this is in the museum at Blaugrena. And you can see there clearly a branded mark and other scratches and marks on it, and two holes in the middle piece for little bungs, little corks or stoppers, to either allow venting or to allow testing through a dipper of what was inside the barrel in its current condition. Now, very interestingly, we started to find this gravel all around the barrels, and basically it was kind of unknown what it was due to the chemical conditions of the water being anoxic, very cold, and basically decomposition of what's there. These little pebbles almost seem to shine underwater, but when you brought them out to the surface, they became dull. A lot of time was spent wondering what these were. Were these inside one of the barrels? Were they something to do with cargo? But basically one idea was, if any of you have visited HMS Victory in Portsmouth Historic Shipyard, in the build down in the base of the ship where the cargo was carried, which was barrels of various things, including gunpowder and food and water, the ballast was gravel. And the idea being that with gravel, you can shovel it around to disperse the ballast and trim out the ship as things are used. You can also lay barrels in it and stop them rolling rather than using heavier ballast. So one hypothesis for this gravel on Gribshunden is it was actually the ballast being used to trim out the ship. And when we come back to what was in those barrels, we found a significant amounts of bones. And if you look at the top right-hand picture there, these are all very small bones up to sort of about the size of a finger. And we didn't really know what they were. We thought, well, maybe it's food for the people on board the ship, you know, chicken or pork or something along those lines. But we sent them off to Lund University's Natural History Department. And the lady there analysing immediately, she opened the bag, was very, very excited and said, these are sturgeon bone. And sturgeon for the Danish king was a little bit like swan for the British Queen. It's like basically a protected creature for the royalty, and basically only allowed to be at the king's table. So a real sort of luxury. Also, the sturgeon are not present in the Baltic anymore. So maybe at this time in 1495 they were. But what was more interesting even than finding that these bone were sturgeon is, as she analysed the finds and started to build them up, she was able to confirm that this was one sturgeon. And sturgeon can be pretty big. The one in the lower right picture is not, of course, the one from the wreck. It's a preserved example of a sturgeon, just to show you, if you don't know what they were like, that's in the Natural History Department at Lund. But they're pretty big fish, so you could quite easily fill a barrel with a relatively small sturgeon. So pretty exciting to find that, and to find that basically we had one whole sturgeon that was the contents of one of these barrels. Remember back to the both the photo map and the hand-drawn plan of the site at the beginning. So the diver on the left there hovering over the hawser eye. As we said before, this is the port side hawser eye. So the port anchor rope or hawser would have gone through that eye to the anchor and then able to be deployed to the seabed. And then obviously there was a starboard one as well. They're pretty good, pretty intact, broken across the front there on this one. The other side is a little bit more buried. The white line you see running from the hawser under the diver, on the first day of the trip, we put a archaeological tape measure from the furthest identifiable piece of the bow all the way out to the furthest identifiable piece of the stern. So pretty much from this hawser to the rudder. You can also see this tape running under the trench and under the right-hand diver in the right-hand picture there. So we always had a measure of where we were in relation to the trench and in relation to the site itself, in conjunction with the digital means by which we were monitoring the site, which we'll come to a little bit later on. So there's the trench on a busy day. We've basically been able to extend the trench by applying for a modification to the permit. We've now got two 6x2 positions. The rear one with the diver on the right is where a lot of the barrels came from and other things that you're shortly about to see. And the further trench over in the distance was where the side of the hull was exposed on the starboard side. You can see the water dredge there, the orange pipe coming in to one of the scientists working in the hull, and another two scientists working in the far end of the hull, and two Guardian rebreather divers there keeping an eye on what's going on. We were very, very lucky as well that Nova, the US film company, sent a film crew to make a documentary on the site. Now it's finished And it's a very interesting documentary. It's not a diving film, it's a purely archaeological historical film. Very similar to the movie done by PBS on the Newport wreck, if any of you have seen that. We've been lucky to see a draft version of it. Its launch has been put back due to the inevitable COVID, but it should be launched on Nova Channel, and then much like the previous movie they did with us on the Tulsa American aircraft, should be shown in the UK at some point. So the shot you've got here has got Evan Kovacs from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, who's our team videographer, filming activities live as they work. And you've got John Adams there working in the hole, excavating and starting to move barrel staves and other smaller timbers out of the way to slowly work down beneath to what lies beneath. And then we get on to the finds. Some of the things we found were really quite amazing. The lower right picture is the main stock, if you like, of a crossbow. And what's happened since, I've worked on a lot of archaeological projects with the universities and organizations I've been mentioning over the years, including the Antikythera shipwreck. But what amazed me with Gribshunden was the speed and ferocity with which research began after we left the water. When we left end of August, beginning of September 2019, immediately the different departments in different universities went to work on photogrammetry modeling of these artifacts, 3D ink printing of these artifacts, and reconstruction. So since we left last September, this beautiful reconstruction crossbow was made by a master craftsman specializing in ancient weaponry, and has since been fired. Sadly, I have video of this, but we couldn't put it into the talk here because of bandwidth. But has since been fired by one of the Swedish archery team and crossbow experts, and proven to be extremely effective and very, very lethal. So it's quite amazing to see this kind of reproduction taking place from finds on the wreck to match them. The second one we found was extremely exciting. When it was first found, it was believed immediately to be another crossbow. And this is very interesting for me as a diver rather than a professional archaeologist to start to learn about the importance of things like context, because this piece that you see on the stretcher for lifting it, bottom right, looks immediately like a crossbow. And right next to it on the wreck, when we excavated the sediment away, literally 5-10 centimeters away was a crossbow bolt. So you're straight away thinking, well, obviously it's a crossbow because there's a crossbow bolt. As it turns out, when we brought it to surface, we had a weapons specialist, archaeological weapons specialist on the trip with us, and immediately identified it from the holes and the carvings in the middle of it, seen in the upper right photo there, as an arquebus. And a very rare find, certainly from this period and from preserved underwater in the sediment from a wreck. And this is basically an early form of shotgun, often fired from the hip, occasionally with a spike, so it could be put into a mounting on the side of the ship. And you've got to remember that a ship of this era was basically pre-big artillery cannons on a boat firing from a distance. The idea here was to come alongside the enemy ship, use grapple hooks and ropes to pull yourselves together, and then brutal, bloody close quarters battle with all the Marines aboard the stern and bow castle, trying to board the other ship and fight with the crossbows, with the arquebus, which is basically a really devastating personnel weapon. We found various shot, larger sizes like in the picture on the right, and smaller sizes like the pellet in the gloved hand on the left. And then on this trip in 2019, the permit did not permit metal detectors on the first trip. So these were all found by sight around the wreck and whilst excavating down through the trench that we were permitted. So you can start to see evidence of the armament of the ship with crossbow, crossbow bolts, arquebus, and shot. When they went to the wreck earlier, previously I showed you the picture of the preserved barrel lid. They also found gun carriages. Now, gun carriages for breech loading cannon. You can see the slots in the carriage where the hoops around the barrel of the gun would sit in those slots, and then the barrel will be tied in place securely, the breech placed in the back and put in with a wedge, and then fired. And these are not so big. They're approximately 1.8 meters long. And the interesting thing was, which is being heavily researched and is a major part of the continuation of our project, is all these gun carriages were found. There are 2 that we know of still remaining on the wreck that you can see as you swim around the site, easily identifiable as what they are, but no cannon. One hypothesis to this that the scientists have proposed is the water conditions on site are such that the iron degrades away in the 500 years it's been sat there, unlike the wood and other materials that are present. One hypothesis is that at the time, because the wreck site is only 9 meters deep, they were salvaged by grapple or possibly even by freedivers, as the Parthenon marbles were salvaged by freedivers when the Mentor wreck sunk off of the island of Kythera in Greece. Again, unknown, but there are plenty of gun carriages there. These ones already conserved and in the museum, and no guns as yet. So this is a big mystery for the ongoing project and something of great interest to us. And then we were talking earlier about the delicacy of objects and not having one of those heavy scaffold grid legs cause damage, putting the footprints on. Picture on the right there, but Dr. Brendan Foley, who I worked for at Lund and have worked for on many previous projects, was excavating one day. I was his second at holding the light and holding the dredge for him. And very, very slowly, amongst all the sediment and dirt and amongst the timbers, this cylindrical object appeared with what appears to be a crest or a mark on it. And gradually, as the seabed was lowered centimetre by centimetre, photographed en route, you can see some stick-like structures to the left of the object. What was gently teased out of the sediment was this incredible drinking tankard. It has a lid, a hinge lid, like one of the big German steins. The hinge was leather, so the lid is intact and preserved, but it wasn't connected anymore. And what was amazing, we don't think, of course, that this was 1495 air, but when you can see in the photo on the right, the tankard is upside down. When it was removed, a bubble of air, quite a large bubble of air, blooped out of the tankard. Now, it's probably decomposition air, but basically unbelievable. And subsequent research, this has been 3D printed, but a research in the object shows that the main drinking part was created from one single piece of wood. So absolutely beautiful. And then we found this, which was really quite intriguing. It's about the size of your thumbnail, middle picture. It's obviously of a bronze brass type metal, and it very obviously has some sort of markings on it, some sort of letters or symbols. Previously, before our trip in 2019, so back in 2006 through 2017, some of the artifacts recovered, including the gun carriages and some of the barrel lids. One other thing was this chainmail you can see on the left of picture. Now, this is decorational chainmail. This is basically of copper-based material, so hasn't degraded or corroded away as the other iron on the ship has. And this is decorative. This would be an upper layer of chainmail that sat over the more weapon-proof chainmail of iron underneath. So likely of a noble, an aristocracy, possibly even the king, because this was the king's ship. The ring that we found, that was about the size of a thumbnail, was quickly identified by one of the archaeologists as a maker's mark. Now, the one on the right there is a reconstruction. And this is a bit like when you have anything made of silver, it's basically giving you permission to put your name on the marker. And here is a CT scan of that, and it says Ulrich the Firemaker. This was the king's metallurgist who was basically making his own personal weaponry. Traceable, he's in the records as Ulrich Firemaker. And then we found a leather pouch, and within that leather pouch there was a lump. The lump is in the photo on the right-hand side. And when that was put into the CT scanner, which is absolutely incredible, you can see on the left there the lines representing there's lots of individual objects in this lump, but it's so accurate it can scan down through the lump, coin by coin, revealing not just that each was an individual coin, but the writing on those coins. And this is lettering M on Mal Moi Ens. Its translation, which is a coin of the city of Malmo, very close to Lund, where I am right now today, and identified from that concreted lump. And this was a large amount of money, possibly the wages of one of the armourers. For me, one of the most magical items was this. Basically, you can see here bits of stick sitting out of the sediment, but here you can see what it is. This is a hand-woven wicker basket for carrying foodstuffs, for example, or something along those lines on the wreck, preserved after 500 years, buried in sediment, not rotted away because of the anoxic conditions, so delicate. Maybe not as impressive as coins or weaponry, but just the sheer delicacy of it, something that really appeals to me with archaeology, what can be preserved and what we can learn. And here, this is why she is called the Griffin Hound. This is her figurehead, recovered right away back in the early expeditions because of the importance, not wanting to go missing or be conserved. Photo at the top left by Richard Lundgren and Ingmar Lundgren, the guys who found the Mars wreck. They lifted the artifact and it went off to Denmark, where they had a big enough treatment facility to treat it with PEG and then to freeze dry it. That's now complete and it's now back in Sweden at the Blekinge Museum, shown at the bottom there in its conserved state. And this is a dragon with a human head in its mouth. Now, what a fearsome thing to see sailing out of the mist towards you if you were the enemy, that your enemy's ship has this huge mythical dragon eating a human head coming towards you with some of those breech-loaded cannons flaring. So pretty amazing. This week, we've been back on site. It was a short trip just to achieve, ideally, 3 to 4 main tasks. The first of which was to use the US system to get a complete digital map of the entire site. The second was to metal detect, because we now have a metal detection permit, the entire site and mark any metal hits from the entire site on the US mapping system. So we now have the photogrammetric map uploaded into the US system, the US track of the divers moving around that photogrammetric map, and all finds marked from an underwater iPad, which is just on the bench in front of the laptop there, live whilst on the site. So metal detecting diver in front puts a plastic peg on the hit, and then the US diver behind marks it on the map live. So that was our first aim, metal detecting and US tracking. Second aim was have a really rather expensive new toy, a water sampler that basically can measure all sorts of things like turbidity, salinity, oxygen levels, etc. So was to get water samples around the sites, around the site itself in the area of the trench to see if we can get any evidence of this degradation of the iron, for example, the cannons. And then the third task was to lift as many of the barrel staves and remaining barrel parts that we had unearthed in the trench in 2019. These were bagged and left on site in the trench because there wasn't facility to conserve them. So they were better preserved, leaving them on the wreck with a gentle burying at the end of the 2019 project. We now had the conservation room in the conservation facilities. And the main aim here is to send these all back to Lund University, where they are now, for dendrochronological analysis to determine where the barrels were made and exactly of which timber. And my last slide there is basically our team logo. This was done in homage to the original Steven Spielberg Jaws movie. In the March-April period of 2019, a small team of us, including Dr. Brendan Foley and myself, went out for a recon dive on site. It was freezing cold being March, April in the Baltic, but the visibility was stunning. And I got this picture of Brendan from my GoPro. The Lund University Art Department caricaturized it, turned it into a cartoon of him. And then we got the Gribshunden coming up without its head in its mouth, trying to grab Brendan. And this was the mimic of the original movie poster for the Jaws movie, with the ascending shark with its mouth open and the swimming girl on the surface. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening, for signing in. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part and to talk in this virtual conference. And thank you very much.